Order. I call the Honourable Member Philip Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was worried that the former member there was slipping into a catatonic slumber as he began to speak more and more slowly as the minutes dragged on. So the House is mercifully released from that last contribution. Mr Speaker, I want to talk about National's housing crisis. The entire country's talking about it, so it's right, sir, that this House talks about it too. The reason that everybody is talking about the housing crisis is that it is corroding away things that we care deeply about in New Zealand. Under the National Government, first home buyers are shut out of the housing market and home ownership is dropping more quickly than ever before. Our children are being hospitalised because that Minister, Nick Smith, refuses to regulate the private rental market and require a decent roof over people's heads, at least insulation and efficient heating. Housing costs are not only squeezing middle-class families across New Zealand, they are wiping out household budgets. Interest rates are about to go up. They're going to add hundreds of dollars to the mortgage repayments of families in the mortgage belt. And as the Child Poverty Monitor told us a few weeks ago, it is rising housing costs that is keeping child poverty high in this country. And at the sharp end of the housing crisis, Mr Speaker, the most vulnerable families are living in tents and sleep-outs and garages, and government agencies are even referring people to live in campgrounds. Well, it's a mess. It's been brewing for several years, almost the entire time that National's been in office, and they have failed to act. For 4 long years, they failed to do anything about the housing crisis. And I guess when you represent the big end of town, I guess when about half your caucus are major landlords, and I guess the concerns of young, struggling first home buyers, of families who are living in substandard and overcrowded accommodation, I guess the concerns of State House tenants are not the top of your list of priorities. And I suppose, sir, given that, and given that the National Party caucus are major property owners in their own right, it's not surprising, for instance, that they oppose a capital gains tax. But to wait 4 long years before doing anything about the housing crisis is unforgivable. And then what do we get? Last year, Nick Calamity Smith running around like a mad thing, turning up at the unveiling of a new door handle, pretending to be Michael Joseph Savage, carrying the furniture of State House tenants into their new house. Endless stream of photo opportunities, little schemes like flogging off broken down old state houses to first home buyers at a heavy discount in provincial New Zealand where there isn't a housing crisis. That is what passes for a housing policy under this government. But sir, it is too little too late. Not even the full force of the Reserve Bank with the LVR lending limits appears to be able to dampen the Auckland housing market. And if you look at the front page of today's New Zealand Herald, you'll see that house price escalation is as rampant as ever under this government. Not even LVRs seem like they can put a dent in it. And the latest data from QV, sir, shows that first home buyers have been squeezed out of the market. But that hasn't stopped prices rising, because the speculators, both foreign and domestic, have stepped into the space. They are snapping up houses, and that minister won't do anything about it. You know, the crazy thing about the housing crisis is that the National Government had the perfect opportunity to do something about it back in 2011, as the housing crisis was beginning to bite. We had low interest rates, an army of builders with nothing to do. We had a city that needed rebuilding after the Canterbury earthquakes, and an economy that desperately needed the stimulus. It would have been the perfect time for a government-backed building program to build houses for first home buyers, to add to the state housing stock, instead of flogging it off as this minister is doing. But the government didn't want to know. They wasted the perfect opportunity to head off the housing crisis as it began to bite. Mr. Speaker, why is the housing crisis such a problem? Why do the opinion polls show that New Zealanders are desperately concerned about it and so disappointed in the failure of the national government to act? Well, I think the first reason, sir, is that the housing crisis and escalating house prices, particularly in Auckland and Christchurch at the moment, is a major cause of the yawning gap between rich and poor in New Zealand. Under the national government, there are basically two classes of people. There are those with assets, the property owners who are raking it in from tax-free capital gains, and most of the National Party caucus are in that category. And then there's the rest, sir, the people who contribute to the prosperity of this nation from the sweat of their brow, who pay tax but are struggling to get ahead because under National, this government is content to run an economy that rewards the speculators. And because National has allowed Auckland house prices to get away on them, and because they mismanaged the rollout of LVRs, they failed to protect first home buyers, as the Prime Minister, middle of last year, crying crocodile tears for first home buyers, saying he was going to sort it out with the Reserve Bank. He would organise a carve-out for first home buyers so that they wouldn't be affected by loan-to-value ratio lending limits that have imposed a 20% minimum deposit on first home buyers in this country. They said they would do something about it, but they did nothing. In fact, under the Official Information Act, what we know is that Bill English didn't ask for advice from Treasury about the effect on first home buyers of those lending limits until after he'd negotiated an agreement with the Reserve Bank to roll out those limits. And what we know is that he didn't even ask Nick Smith, the Housing Minister, for the advice on the impact of first home buyers in writing. They simply discussed it at one of their regular catch-ups. That's how much National cares about first home buyers. They've allowed these LVR lending limits to shut first home buyers out of the market, and as a result, Generation X and Generation Y under National are becoming a nation of renters. But perhaps just as bad, sir, just as depressing, is that the housing crisis and Nick Smith's inept, chaotic mismanagement of housing policy is blighting the life chances, sir, of hundreds of thousands of Kiwi children. When a youngster in Te Atatu, in my electorate, sir, in West Auckland, is living with her family and her 4 siblings in an uninsulated one-room garage, as reported in the Western Leader recently, it's inevitable that that youngster will get sick in the winter. She is not going to be able to do her homework properly when she's sharing a one-room skyline garage with the rest of her family. And when that family moves from place to place, as it inevitably will, sir, to relatives, share it crammed into a spare room, into a sleep out, to emergency accommodation if they're lucky, that young girl is going to be moved from pillar to post, from one school to another. And that is why in West Auckland there are a number of primary schools who report a wildly fluctuating roll. It is because of housing insecurity, it is because of the housing crisis, and this government's failure to do anything meaningful about it. The Bay of Plenty Times, Mr. Speaker, reports today a desperate family were forced to live in a tent for 5 weeks as they waited for Housing New Zealand to find them a house. Now, Housing New Zealand have apologised for that. They've apologised for the fact that it took them a story in the Bay of Plenty Times before they even visited the family. But, sir, Housing New Zealand statistics tell us themselves that there are 77 vacant properties in the Bay of Plenty at the moment. But Housing New Zealand staff couldn't even visit a family living by the river in a park in a tent because a house was not available to them. So even though National's housing crisis is widening the gap between the rich and the poor, even though it's driving families into poverty, it's making our children sick because that Minister Nick Smith refuses to regulate the standard of housing in the private rental market, National is denying ordinary New Zealanders a decent start in life for their children. They refuse to tackle the fundamentals of the housing crisis. They refuse to tax speculators Even though Auckland has become a speculator's paradise, speculators, both foreign and domestic, are driving prices higher and higher and out of the reach of ordinary New Zealanders. National refuses to build affordable starter homes for first home buyers. They refuse to set minimum standards for private rental properties. All we get is photo opportunities, tinkering with the RMA, and the running down of Housing New Zealand, the last part of the housing safety net for New Zealanders in need. It's a disgrace.
I call the Honourable Minister, Judith Collins.